Hi, thank you for joining us. Today we have Jaclyn Pederson, the CEO of Feeding Matters, which is a nonprofit organization that helps parents of children with all sorts of feeding issues. So they're a wonderful resource. We have their link actually on our website. So Jaclyn has worked as their CEO for 11 years. She is a mom of two boys, and she actually is also a mom of a child with pediatric feeding disorder. So she has a unique perspective on being, on the advocacy side and the personal side, which is really interesting. And she is a really strong advocate for parents to get the information that they need and the help that they need, because feeding is so complex, right? As we know and always are talking about. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Christine. Really grateful to be here.
Of course. So, I know we had talked a little bit before we started recording, and you mentioned that one of your two boys was more a typical feeding progression, and then the other boy was not. So, what was that journey like? Can you take us through like how you kind of discovered his feeding issues? And because you were working in this role for Feeding Matters, but you didn't necessarily have that personal experience until a little bit later, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so I had been with Feeding Matters for a really long time, and I took over in this role when my first son was 7 months old. And so I'd already kind of like known that we don't know a lot about feeding. We're not told a lot of information as parents about feeding. And so that taught me a lot about, okay, we need to be talking about what is pediatric feeding development and what should parents be expecting. But then when I had George, and he's about to turn 2 this month, he struggled from the very start with feeding. And I knew it was like, I knew something was wrong, but it's so wild because I consider myself a pediatric feeding disorder advocate and expert. Um, but I still had a hard time advocating for what he needed and I think it's just because parents can't always be the ones doing that. Like, even though we know something's wrong, we also need our medical community to help us identify these children as well. So he struggled very early on. Um, I kind of kept asking different questions, but I probably wasn't articulating it as well or making it as serious of a question as I maybe needed to get a provider to pay attention to it right away. So we didn't identify some of his stuff until he was like 6 weeks to 8 weeks. And he had some challenges like anatomical. So we had to like switch out different bottles. We did play around with, does he need a tongue release and some of those things. And then he also had a cow's milk protein allergy. And so once we kind of got on that track, we were able to like really figure out and get to our like plateau and figure out, what the challenges were, at least at that point. And so I think that's what we find with
Right.
families too, is once they can kind of identify some things, they can get to a good place and then they're okay for a little bit. But then as he got older and older and older, we were starting to introduce food and those different things. And so I think I had like a lot of alarms going off in my head of like, oh, I've
Right.
seen and heard this story so many times from families about how this can take a left turn.
Yes,
And
when
he
they
was
start
struggling with
solids.
yeah, yeah, those
Yeah.
transition
Or
periods.
even after, like sometimes they're like, oh, they were eating and then at 1 or then at 2, they like started to like all of a sudden they
Uh-huh.
started like dropping their foods, right?
Yep. Yep.
So
And
sometimes it's at 6 months when they like start solids too. So yours was like around the 6 month.
well, it was just like that's when I started noticing lots of like constipation and some of that
Mhm.
stuff. And I think what we don't talk about a lot in feeding is how much constipation impacts how we
Oh my
feel about
goodness.
eating. Like, you
Absolutely.
don't want to eat
No.
if you're not regular and you are constipated. And so it just gave me a good perspective in terms of what our families face. We've been able to navigate it pretty well. He is pretty adventurous at almost 2. There was
That's
a
great.
there was a time at it was like our 2 appointments ago when I thought he was doing great with feeding. And then she was like, "Oh, he's dropped weight." I was like, "Gosh, again." And so, I think that, you know, he's we'll see, because I wanna say we're on the right trajectory, but I also wanna be hesitant to, not be blindsided by anything in the future either. But I do think that he's, like, still kept a positive relationship throughout all of this, and we just tried to take the pressure off when he wasn't wanting to eat. But I do think that over the course of time, he's had a milder case, and I hope it's because he got a lot of that early identification. And that's what I
Right.
hope to fight for families, is that we have a medical system that can ask them the right questions, can ask them enough and deep enough questions and identify them early, so that we're not having those long-term psychosocial damages that we're seeing our kids have in elementary school and even growing up into teens and adults.
Oh my gosh, I know. That is like a really big, and you mentioned a few things, right? So I would even go back to like the gut, like the constipation and the gut, right? But there was, and it is so common, like whenever we do an evaluation, we go all the way back to actually even before birth a little bit, but we want to know like what was it really like at the beginning, because there's almost always those red flags. Like there
Oh,
was like
mhm.
either a latch issue or they didn't take to the breast milk, or maybe mom had a low supply. But those are all red flags for latch issues and, maybe like cow's milk protein allergies and things like that. And those are those early indicators that's like, oh, they're not having a great relationship with food. And that can show up later on in life, even if they've had some success with food. Right. So you saw
Right,
that
because I think
personally.
yeah, yeah, even if you do get to a place where you feel like you've gotten to a success and we're on the right track, we just have to be aware of it. We need to have enough awareness, both as a medical system and as parents too, that it could mean other things down the future. Because I think that's what happens is we got into we felt like we were doing well, and then we're like, oh, maybe not. And so,
Right. Yeah,
I
that's how I
definitely think
felt too with my
is
son, because
it?
I had similar
Yeah.
issues to you, a lot of trouble feeding in infancy. And
Mhm.
then he started out really good. He was eating lots of foods. And then all of a sudden he started dropping. He didn't want pasta anymore. He didn't want meat anymore. He didn't want any greens. And now we were on an upswing. But then, like, now every once in a while, he'll be like, oh, like he'll start analyzing. And I'm like, no, like, there is that, like I almost feel like it's like, it's like never totally gone, but knowing what to do and knowing like, oh, okay, I see him starting to freak out about this, having the skills and being like, I know what to do, I know what to say, so that maybe we can cut it off and it doesn't escalate or, into like a spiral of like negative types of things with food, right?
Well, and that's the whole thing, is we really tried to keep up a positive experience with even ourselves, and I think we're still learning and we're still working on all of that. But that's really hard, and that's for our situation where we've had a lot of the issues identified. Like we whereas I know that there are some families that they are still working through, like, what is happening before we get to like what we need to do to advance our skills, to
Right.
make sure that our nutrition and our psychology at mealtimes is in a good place. And so, yeah, it is. It's an ebb and a flow. I think we find that for any level of severity around
Yeah,
pediatric feeding disorders, and
absolutely.
it's definitely challenging, and that's why families need all of the support that they can get.
Yeah. And one of our clients actually said it way better than I could. She goes, I
Yeah.
know it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I was like, yes, that's exactly what it is. It is a
Mhm.
journey. And I feel like
Mhm.
it's so it's like almost more of like a parent's journey too. Like it's not, I always try to say it's not like, don't look at it as like, well, that's their problem and I'm going to go and fix their problem, because it's still part of your problem too. And it affects your mindset and your how you view meal times and how you approach,
Sure.
everything, because
Yeah.
it's like eating's like an emotional thing too. Like it's tied to like your culture and your family and your like everyday experiences. So it's so hard not to get emotional and like
Mhm.
like wrapped up in the like stress of it, right?
Yeah. When you have your expectations of yourself as a mom,
Mhm.
you have your stressors as a mom, and parent. And I do think we have a lot of expectations on ourselves. And feeding is so complex because it does involve more than one person, like you're saying. Like it is that parent child dyad. It is them and us teaching them how to be autonomous and how to be independent in their eating journey.
Yeah.
But it does involve how we think about food, our relationship with food, how we're showing up to the table, how regulated or maybe not that we are. And what does that mean for what the whole environment looks like and what the situation looks like? And the challenge is that it's compounded with so much stress if a child is struggling and there is a conversation about weight and weight gain, and so then that feels like an extra
Yes.
threat. And if it gets really bad, if there's a conversation about tubes, like that's an added threat. And so
Oh,
it's incredibly
absolutely.
stressful
It is.
for families. And so I think that's why it's not often talked about, but I hope we do feel more comfortable talking about it now. I've loved to see how uh, just how much we're more open to talking about some of these challenges in parenthood, even, I mean, beyond some of the picky eating to PFD challenges, but
Yes.
just in general, how hard it can be and how we need to support ourselves and each other.
And it's funny because like you were mentioning like the picky eating before, and right, that's like the name of the podcast, and that's like
Yeah.
how I market kind of. But
Mhm.
I always say we actually don't work with picky eaters because picky eater, like just the little picky eating that is more like a typical developmental stage that kids pass through. What we have are kids who are extremely selective and fearful and have sensory issues and oral motor issues, and but no one knows what to call it, right? And just a few years ago, the term pediatric feeding disorders came about because of the great work that you guys have done. So there was a name, like a label to it, but parents still associate it with picky eating. So that's how people find me, right? But now
Yeah.
there's even another term, ARFID, that has come
Hmm.
on the scene that I feel like has overtaken pediatric feeding disorders in some ways. Parents are latching on to this term that I personally feel like does not actually encompass or describe their child's issues. And it makes me a little upset because you're missing the gut component, the oral motor component, and sometimes it's being diagnosed by a psychologist who can't accurately gauge their sensory profile, their oral motor skills. So, or probably knows nothing about nutrition and gut. So they're just only focusing on the fear. But when you don't focus on the other three areas, if that hasn't been brought to the parent's attention, then I honestly I think that they might hit a brick wall. They might not even be making progress because that might not be the area that needs to be focused on first.
I will say that's one of my biggest concerns about how popular RFID has gotten. Um, I I think for families, finding a name means a lot. And that is exactly why we did the work that we did for pediatric feeding disorder. Because so oftentimes we were trying to share how important this issue was, but we didn't have a name for it beyond it's not picky eating and
Yes.
it's something else more serious. But I think, when you get this because you're very in your approach is holistic. And that's what we hope to encourage within the RFID framework as well. And so we've done a lot to try to say, okay, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder came out of the mental health handbook, so the DSM,
Mhm.
and it is primarily used by psychologists, although we are starting to see other disciplines get involved.
Mhm.
And they are seeing these kids too. They are starting to study these kids, but they're studying these kids at maybe like 7 through 13 after they have had this whole history.
Right.
Back to kind of the importance of history, after they have had this whole history of these challenges and maybe going to different feeding therapies and trying different things and not getting the care that they needed. And so we've tried to work in partnership with a lot of the RFID experts to say, hey, like, let's not forget about pediatric feeding disorder and about how important it is to think about pediatric feeding disorder as a framework in all of those four domains,
Mhm.
the medical side, the feeding skill side, the nutrition side, and the psychosocial side. And the journey of the RFID and PFD conversation has been really interesting for me in particular because I have such a core history to PFD and like such a bias, I guess, to PFD. But it's been interesting learning about the ARFID world a little bit more. And, that diagnosis I thought had just been like one that we were going to kind of bring into the PFD world and we were going to do this all together and more holistically. But what I didn't realize was we had a whole eating disorder world that was researching it, putting a lot of infrastructure behind it, really putting some framework to it in of itself, and that's what got it to become so popular. And so what we realize is that they're very much like looking at very similar things and just maybe looking at them slightly differently. um but because we are where we are today, which is ARFID's gotten very popular, we've kind of forgotten about the some of the PFD side of it. We need to bring them together and help our ARFID colleagues understand the PFD framework, and that medical really does need to be evaluated, and we really need to have a better understanding of feeding skill before we're assigning an RFID diagnosis.
Right.
And so
Right.
what we try to, in bringing this consensus group together, I think it was really shocking to them to know how long the feeding development window was. Like, even as an organization, we're almost 20 years old. We used to say that, feeding was until 5 years old, but I think we're realizing we're developing our feeding skills much longer, and we're even refining our feeding skills even longer than that. And so, just like a child who may be going through a typical toddler pickiness can dive into some of the disordered side of it, that
Mhm.
can happen during the feeding development window. And so we can't forget about feeding skills while we're trying to work on this. And yeah, I hope we can do a lot more together and collaboratively, because it is definitely a challenge. And I never want to have a family not feel like a diagnosis fits their child, because they finally found a name for what they've been going through and that name fits. But what we want to do is kind of scaffold around it and make sure that we're working on these things together. Um,
Yeah, I think that's a good healthy approach, right? And I think, yeah, if the psychologist, if they can kind of um bring in some of that information, the things that we've been talking about, like ruling out. But the issue with ruling out things like the gut issues and the oral motor issues is actually the lack of training and information that parents even have access to. So I'll
mhm.
give you an example, like gut testing. A lot of parents will say, "Oh, well, we went to a GI doctor and they ruled out there's no allergies." And I was like, "But that does not rule out that there's no sensitivities. That doesn't tell me about what kind of bacteria is under or overgrowth. That doesn't tell me if there's any things like parasites or yeast, right, happening." And all of those things might make them uncomfortable and not want to eat, right? So the gut tests are considered functional medicine and not covered by insurance. So it
Mm,
makes it out of reach for a lot of parents,
mhm.
right? So that's one issue. And then the oral motor skills, it's not really taught in grad school for speech pathologists. So
No.
unless you have specialty training in it,
Yep.
I've gotten reports from feeding therapists that say oral motor is all within normal limits. And I look at their mouth and I'm like, what do you mean normal limits? There's nothing within normal limits about any of their muscle skills in the mouth. So there is like a big disconnect of like, well, who's saying that everything's okay, right? So, think people might be hearing from one person everything's great, and then if you go to another person, they might be seeing a whole host of issues. So like there's no like consistency in it. And that's where I
Yeah.
always tell parents you have to ask questions. Well, great, just because they don't have a milk allergy, something else is going on because they're still constipated, right? So something we still need to do more digging. You can't just say everything's fine and just send me on my way, right? So there has to be more
Mhm.
to it. But that's my thing is that there's still so
No,
much.
no, I love your soapbox. I do think that, like, because it's that's what makes it so complex. Like, Feeding Matters is here as a patient advocacy organization to make sure that we are supporting families. And the best way we know how to support families is to try to fix some of the system challenges. And that started with giving this a name. Now it's kind of like making sure that we get the right name. We have DNR fit and we're working really means, like the education on the professional side landscape too. Like uh many families don't know that there really isn't a great specialty educational pathway for a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist, and what does that mean, and who are they seeing for what, and what are
Mhm.
they working on, and what does that mean as it relates to their insurance. And so it does feel like the wild west. And so
Yeah.
unfortunately, while the burden shouldn't be on families, just like I shouldn't have been the one to like keep bringing it up to my provider for my son, but the burden really is on families to make sure they're asking those questions of their feeding therapists and of their providers to get a better understanding of what was their specialty education. The unfortunate thing is, and you know this, as coming out of school, you had to do all of this self education on your own and you had to figure this out on your own. And I don't think that
Yes.
needs to be the case in the long run, and hopefully we can work that out.
I
But in
hope
the
so.
meantime, families are in the middle, and
They are. I know,
and
I know. I
mhm,
hate that too. But, some of them just don't know what they don't know. Like, they could,
yeah,
some parents can afford to do more. They just don't even know that there's more
yep,
to know, right?
yeah,
But that's why your organization is so amazing because, I always say, like, even if you're not sure, go look at their resources because, you have so much there. Like, why not just take advantage of all the hard work you guys have already done on behalf of parents to, educate. And I like great. That's why I have the podcast. That's why we have our parent course, because parent education is so paramount. Like I feel like we've never had a successful case or a case that progressed quickly when the parents didn't have the knowledge and they were not involved. Like, we've had kids on our caseload for 2 years that should never have been there for 2 years, but the parents literally do nothing between the time that the therapist leaves and comes back the
mhm,
next week. And we tell them, like, you're not going to make progress that way. And some people don't
mhm,
care. And then we have other families that literally listen to everything we do. They're constantly, and then their progress is amazing, right? So we know how
yeah.
amazing parent involvement is and how
It
important it is.
it's hard. It goes back to that parent-child dyad because it is that relationship. Feeding and having challenges with feeding it's not something you can unfortunately take a break from. Like, if you're going to
No.
physical therapy for a broken leg or a knee problem, like, you can take a week off and be fine. But when you're working on feeding, it's every meal. And so I think the challenge for families is maybe some of them don't have the readiness. Maybe it is a hesitation or a hope that you can kind of fix this. I've
Yes.
seen it look many different ways for families, and based on where they're at in their own personal journey of it too, because and that's the unfortunate thing is we do tell families, it takes a longer time. Like, it takes us, like we said, it's longer now, but it takes us around 5 years to learn how to eat. And so if there's any disruption in that, it's going to take a long time. And so, um, yeah, you can kind of scale it up based on your involvement or not, and how much you want to put into it.
Yeah.
Um, is
Yeah, I think sometimes it's just
difficult,
hard, they just
unfortunately.
don't have the bandwidth to they're busy, they have full-time jobs, they have other
That's
kids,
the part
there's
that I always find is so
sports,
hard.
there's
Hmm.
a lot everyone has a lot going on, so it's hard to it takes a lot of bandwidth feeding to, like,
It takes a lot of bandwidth. Like, you've got mental load on feeding no matter what your circumstance is.
even a normal every
Mhm.
let's just
I
say
don't
they
like
don't have
picking
any
what's for
feeding.
dinner and lunch and breakfast every day. I
Right,
don't.
right.
For
On a
a family
good
of 4.
day with no issues, feeding is
Yeah.
still a challenge for most families. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's a challenge of, like, money putting food on the table or, like, time because they don't have time. and then add on to it like, oh, well, they don't like eating or they have trouble eating or, they're afraid to eat. Like that is like a lot of other layers, right? So
Yep.
it's a lot. And parents definitely need more support for this for sure. So that's why I'm so grateful that you guys made this organization. It's incredible.
Thank
Um,
you.
yeah. Let's see. Was there anything else I really wanted to chat about?
Well, one
Um,
thing that I forgot to mention that I did feel like was really important, um, was in talking about bringing the eating disorder world together with the pediatric feeding world and
Mhm.
really talking about the ARFID and PFD overlap, you realize how much we're saying the same things, but using different terms. And I think
Mm,
that is a very common thing in medicine in general, but like very specifically in feeding. And so I think one thing that's happening is we may be doing the same things and using different words, but I think there's also we're using the same words like sensory and meaning different things. And
Oh, that's
so
really interesting. I love that perspective.
I it it's I don't know. We'll continue to be trying to work on this. But I do think that based on your discipline, the way you're approaching sensory and how you understand sensory is very different. Whether you're a psychologist, an occupational therapist, a speech language pathologist, I think we all have a different depth to dive into a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point too, right? And that's what bringing everybody together will hopefully maybe we can get like some,
I
consensus on
hope.
like, let's just pick one. Let's just pick one way
Yeah,
to.
I mean, that's really we're trying to build like that shared language and a family-centered language because we also know so many words are very charged
Yeah,
in this space as well. And
right.
so we're just trying to work on it from all ends
Yeah.
because we
And I
know
mean, a
families
lot
need
of
it
our
more.
kids with the feeding too, they have other diagnoses as well. Like they might
Yeah.
have Down syndrome, autism. A lot of kids with autism also are very,
Yes.
very selective and limited in what they'll eat.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then there's the whole like bringing in the diet because when you're not eating healthy foods, we're usually they're eating junk or they're eating, like more processed foods, right? That's what I would consider junk. Or they're eating like breads, things that break down into sugar. So they have like an enormous amount of sugar in their body, but not the vitamins and minerals that are going to help their brain learn and develop, the way that it should. So that's like one of my biggest concerns too is, there's like this period of time, like if they're not eating or they're afraid to eat, well, how are they still getting those nutrients in? That I think
Yeah.
is like a really big, like secondary problem that it's like nutrition deficiency that a
Mhm.
lot of pediatricians brush off as like, oh, it's okay. They'll be fine. They're gaining weight. They're on their curve, whatever they say. Right.
Yep. All of those myths are so challenging because it's like, what are we doing to keep them on their curve? And yeah, what is the undercurrent of the nutrition because they're on their curve?
Right.
Um,
Right. They might be on
and
their curve, but they might be only eating like Fruit Loops. So that's
yeah,
not
yeah.
great.
Uh-huh. And that's why, like for PFD, you can qualify for pediatric feeding disorder by having dysfunction in any of the one domains. It
Yeah.
doesn't just have to be like how are you showing up at meal times from a psychological perspective or your skill or your
Mhm.
medical sides and then your nutrition side because it is the nutritional implications of the interaction of the feeding skill and psychology domain, they're serious and definitely worth paying attention to because I think it also involves do you feel good to eat and do you feel there's just that's why it's so complex. And if there's
So
anything we can
complicated.
make sure that we continue to talk about is how complex it is and how we need to pay
Yeah.
attention to that complexity.
Yes, I know that was like one thing when I was learning about it was I was like, so that's why I took so many courses because I would take one
Mm,
course and it
yeah.
would present something and I was like, Oh, well, I guess I need to learn all about the sensory or the okay. Oh, well, wait, okay. I guess I need to learn all about the gut now. And then I guess I need, well, wait. So there's a difference between kids who are infants, kids who are early toddlers, kids who are later toddlers. So then I had to take a course on each one of those because each one of those stages kind of is its own like little different beast, right? So yeah, oh my gosh, is it complex? Like it was a rabbit hole that turned into like a tunnel. Like it was crazy.
Well, and that kind of circles us back to the specialty challenge. Like you had to do all of that.
Right,
And families don't always know when their provider has done that or hasn't done that. And so I think asking that
right.
question is really important because it sounds like because you've done all that work, you really think about it holistically. And
Yeah,
you think about all of the different pieces and variables and how they interact or impact the other pieces and variables.
yeah, yeah. But super complex for sure. Like that, yeah, like you said, that cannot be understated. That feeding is very complex. That's like the
Yeah,
number one
really is.
takeaway
That's
for
why we
all
need our own
parents.
specialty pathway for sure.
Oh, I know. I absolutely. At this point, I should have a doctorate with all of the extra courses I've taken.
I
But,
think you're
you
not
know,
alone for some people feeling that way because it is. It's been a
right,
lot. The list is
it's a
so long, I'm
lot.
sure.
Yeah, but you know, there's that sometimes there's that lack of respect too between doctors and
Mm,
speech pathologists or people that, you know, say they're
mhm,
feeding specialists or therapists or whatever. But it's like, well, I'm the doctor. And it's like, well, I know a lot about this other stuff too. I really think you
yeah.
should listen to it at least a little bit, right? And sometimes it's
Mhm.
just poo-pooed, like, oh well,
Well,
you
you're
know,
dismissed just like the families are.
yes,
Um,
right. Sometimes
and
it's no different than the parents.
I oftentimes when we're trying to figure out how do we need to support our professionals, we think about our feeding specialists a lot as almost being similar to how we support our families because
Yes.
you're struggling for validation just as much as families are struggling for validation in
Right.
a specialty that hasn't been given a lot of credit.
Yeah.
And it's hard. And so you're constantly fighting for your families. You're constantly trying to do better for your families.
Yeah.
And all at the same time, you weren't set up well for this. You had to go learn this on your own. And so
Mm.
I think
Yeah.
pediatricians and primary care physicians and doctors in general, while I think they don't understand the field unless they've had personal or interaction or have done that work on their own, um, I think it can be easy for them to dismiss because there is such a wide array of people, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they've seen a feeding specialist who hasn't had a lot of education, and then they assume that that's how the whole field is, and that can be
Right.
a
Right.
challenge.
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Mhm.
So, but all of the work you're doing, I'm sure will in the future, it'll all look very different because of what you're doing. So
That's
that's
our
what's so
hope. Thanks,
amazing.
Christine. We
Of
really
course.
try to make sure we're collaborative in it and we keep like our vision for what we want to see in 20 years. And hopefully we'll get there. We just got to take small steps and get everybody with us as we're doing it,
Right.
which
And
is
that's what I always tell the
qualifying.
parents. I'm like, the baby steps will lead to the leaps, right? You need to embrace and be excited about every baby step. Otherwise, you're not going to get the big leaps and bounds that you're hoping for. So,
That's such a great point because that's what we share with families, but I think sometimes we forget to take our own advice because I'm like, yeah, I want a specialty certificate now, or like I want like all of this research to change overnight and make sure we are more family centered in all of our stuff. But we do have to celebrate the baby steps along the way for the
yeah,
system side as well. So that's a great point.
absolutely. So where can people learn more about Feeding Matters and what kind of resources do you have for families?
So people can learn about us at Feeding Matters on any social channel. Feedingmatters.org is our website. We have a family support roadmap. So it is the first place that I would share for a family that maybe is looking for some support when you know something is wrong and you're trying to figure out is it wrong and you already know, but maybe this will help you get some information that'll help you share that with your provider to get more support in place. And our family support roadmap asks our screening questions about PFD. And then we offer our family guide to PFD, which is kind of like a 101. It's like, what are some of the common tests? What are some of the names? How do the four domains work together? What are some commonly asked questions? Some of those things. And then we have a provider directory where families can go find a provider in their area. And finally, if you really just want someone to talk to about this, we offer our Power of Two parent to parent coaching program, which allows a family who is new to this journey to be able to talk to a family who's been there before. And I feel like that means the world to our families because they have gone through this hearing advice, often well-meaning advice, but still challenging advice from parents and friends and professionals about they'll grow out of it or give them to me for the weekend and I'll get them to eat or, have you fed
Oh
them
gosh.
chocolate? And it's like, they need to just be with someone who
Yeah.
understands it and gets it and who has been there. And so if you do want to talk to someone like that, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to connect you.
Oh, I love that. That is probably the most valuable resource. I love that so
It's
much.
truly the heart
Parents
of our
must love this.
organization. Mhm.
That's amazing. I'm sure all of our parents should reach out to you for that. Just that alone. I mean, like that's incredible. Like sometimes you really do just need someone to be like, "Oh, yeah, I know. I had that same problem." Or, "Yep, I had that. Someone said that to me and this is how I dealt with it." Or, just having that like community kind
Yeah.
of feel.
Well, we know that as moms for anything like that too. I mean, I often like have those conversations over text message with sleeping as well. Like
Yeah,
this is awful.
absolutely.
But
Absolutely. Oh,
Mhm.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to share before we left?
No, I
I think we
appreciate this
covered a lot.
conversation. Yeah, we did cover a lot. I went everywhere.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. I hope everybody follows Jaclyn at Feeding Matters on all the social media channels and definitely go to their website. Make sure you're checking out all of their resources and sign up to chat with another family. And, maybe one day you can be that support for somebody else, after you've gone through your journey. So that's wonderful. And thanks for joining us. And we will see you next week.
Thank you for listening to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater. To learn more about achieving your child's feeding goals, check out Christine's website at foodologyfeeding.com. And be sure to tune in next time to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater.